It was one of those pale afternoons when the light over Oxford seems to recede before it has properly arrived. I had taken my usual seat in the King's Arms, in that corner where the table is worn smooth by decades of elbows, and the window lets in enough grey to make the crossword print seem slightly apologetic. The fire was half-hearted, the air damp with the ghost of a recent drizzle. I had been staring at the clue for 17 across, perfumed memory lingering, 9, and finding that it teased but refused to yield. Someone passed close behind me. No sound beyond the whisper of fabric, but the air shifted. The scent was faint, the kind that does not announce itself so much as arrive late, like a thought returning unbidden. I found my hand resting above the crossword as though the clue had been answered without a single letter filled in. It was not a modern fragrance, nothing chemical, nothing of the department store's glass counters. Warmer, somehow, an arrangement of spice and softened florals. I had known it before. Not last week, not last year, but far enough back that its return seemed improbable. I turned, of course, but the doorway was already closing on whoever had passed. I'm not given to following strangers for the sake of a mystery in the air. Still, the crossword remained unsolved. Lewis arrived in that way of his, the solid frame appearing through the door like a man certain he was interrupting something, but equally certain it was necessary. He lowered himself opposite me, producing that expression which signaled a case, though never the sort of case the television police might enjoy. "Miss Agnes Feltham," he began, "the retired librarian from St. Simeon's, found in her flat this morning. No signs of violence. Doctors saying natural causes. She was in her 70s, lived alone." I nodded, though the name took its time in finding a place in my mind. Not a friend, certainly. An acquaintance by extension of the Bodleian's quieter corners. The kind of woman who could catalogue a century without once raising her voice. She'd left Oxford some months ago, I thought. Cornwall, perhaps. Somewhere where stone meets sea and nothing in particular happens. Lewis went on. A neighbor had noticed milk left outside for 2 days. Police entry, a body in bed. Curtains drawn, the air of a place that had stopped before the woman within it had been ready to. And yet, here was the thing. I had seen her, or at least believed I had. A library reception at St. Simeon's 3 weeks ago. The college had been commemorating the acquisition of some rare quartos, and I had gone partly out of habit, partly out of hunger for their sherry. Among the clusters of gowns and silver hair, I'd thought I glimpsed her across the room in conversation with the warden. There was no announcement, no reintroduction. She was simply there. The moment passed, the evening passed, but the smell, that same warm, deliberate perfume, had reached me then as it did today. When Lewis asked what was wrong, I said nothing of sense or half-glimpsed faces. It was enough for now to consider the crossword again. The clue seemed to tilt toward afterglow or reminisce, but neither quite fit. I wrote nothing. As we left the pub, the air outside carried a cold more direct than anything inside. Students hurried by, their scarves trailing color against the stone. Somewhere, a bell marked the hour without conviction. The city had begun its evening drift toward quiet, but in my mind, the day had not ended. The perfume, hers, surely hers, lingered still, not as an answer, but as a question without a proper space in the grid. The morning had that washed-out quality peculiar to Oxford in autumn, where the damp seems to have been here all along, and only now has the courtesy to make itself felt. Lewis drove us through the narrowing lanes to St. Simeon's, the tires hissing faintly over wet leaves. I had not been inside the college in some years. Its name alone conjured a particular shade of sandstone and a certain reluctance to admit the century in which one was living. The gate opened onto a quadrangle drained of color. The cloisters, dark with rain, smelt faintly of stone that has never quite dried. In the far corner, a gardener bent over the beds with the patient futility of a man tending to plants that would be dead by week's end. Lewis muttered something about the cold and pulled his coat closer. Sir Clement Drayton received us in the warden's rooms, a space so perfectly arranged it could have been set for a portrait. Books aligned without the interference of recent handling, a decanter poised but unopened, the fire emitting more light than warmth. He rose with the courtesy of a man accustomed to visitors whose presence was both necessary and faintly unwelcome. "So distressing," he said, "this business of poor Miss Feltham. She was with us for, well, it must have been 40 years. He paused, as though the span of her service were too long for a living person and therefore difficult to measure. Old-fashioned, yes, but meticulous. The college library would not have been what it is without her. I asked if she had returned recently. No, he assured me. She retired to Cornwall in the summer. She had not set foot in Oxford since. The certainty in his tone might have passed for truth had I not already carried in my mind the sight, or near sight, of her at that library reception. I let him finish his polished reminiscence without interruption. We were shown to the library. The air was thick with the perfume of old bindings, a fragrance I trust above most perfumes to tell the truth. Near the entrance stood a memorial display. A framed photograph of Agnes, her gaze diverted slightly from the camera, surrounded by a modest arrangement of lilies and a slip of card bearing a line of verse. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have lost at all." I stood a moment longer than was necessary. The line, of course, was Tennyson, but no true admirer of the poet would have misremembered it so. The word was loved, not lost. A small error, and perhaps meaningless, but my mind is rarely persuaded to dismiss such substitutions. The staff, when coaxed into speech, echoed the warden's descriptions. Agnes was precise, solitary, dedicated. None spoke with real affection, only that tempered respect one accords to the reliable but unentertaining. One young assistant recalled her tendency to correct misfiled volumes without comment, as if the correction itself were the entire communication. It was the porter, a man whose face seemed to have been carved to match the stone arch of the gate, who provided the only departure from the chorus. He had seen her, or someone like her, a fortnight ago. Early evening, crossing the quad toward the north gate. Hat, coat, the sort of walk he would have known anywhere. He'd greeted her, but she'd passed without response. I asked if he might have been mistaken. His look was that of a man insulted by the very possibility. When I put this to Sir Clement, he smiled, the kind of smile that speaks of error politely ignored, and repeated that Miss Feltham was in Cornwall. The weather there, he added, was milder this time of year. Outside, the drizzle had turned finer, as if the sky were testing the patience of those below. We crossed the cloisters in silence. My shoes carried the faint scent of the library with them, but beneath it, somewhere between the stone and the lilies, I thought, just for an instant, that I could still smell her perfume. The solicitor's office was one of those Victorian conversions that never quite sheds the air of its previous life. High windows admitting only a reluctant light, wood paneling too somber for modern paint to touch, and a faint smell of dusted curtains that must have been hung before the war. Mr. Fairchild, the man in charge of Miss Feltham's estate, had the lean, careful look of someone who measured words in shillings. He read from the will as if it were a ledger, untroubled by the names within it. To St. Simeon's College she left her personal collection of 18th-century volumes. All except for one, a quarto edition of Shenstone's poetical works, bequeathed to a Mrs. Helena Swithin of Observatory Street, Jericho. Lewis glanced at me. Fairchild explained he had never met Mrs. Swithin until the reading, and that Miss Feltham had not offered any written explanation for the exception. It was simply recorded, with the same tidy script as the rest, in her final testament. Jericho in the autumn is a neighborhood of narrow streets where the color drains from brick as readily as from sky. Mrs. Swithin's house was set back behind an iron gate whose latch stuck twice before yielding. She received us without surprise, a tall woman whose greying hair was arranged with the precision of someone accustomed to being observed. She said she had barely known Agnes, met her at the Bodleian many years ago, spoke occasionally at lectures, nothing more. Her voice had the steadiness of someone reciting a lesson already committed to memory. Yet while she spoke, her eyes kept returning, almost against her will, to a sealed envelope on the desk by the window. Not a bill, not junk, something of a size and weight to suggest more deliberate contents. She offered tea. I accepted, partly to prolong the scene. The cups were fine bone china, faintly translucent at the rim. When she poured, her hands betrayed her. Trembling in small, rapid movements, she tried to steady against the saucer. I asked whether she had been surprised by the bequest. She smiled, a fraction too quickly, and said she supposed Agnes had thought her a lover of poetry. Lewis, polite as ever, let the conversation wind down. I noticed the curtains drawn just enough to obscure the street, though it was not yet 4 in the afternoon. There was a faint warmth in the air, the residue of a perfume too well bred to announce itself. I filed the scent away, not trusting the moment, but unwilling to discard it. We left without the envelope moving from its place. The iron gate closed behind us with the stubborn click of something resuming its usual position. As we reached the street, Lewis spoke in that half-amused, half-curious tone of his. "You notice that smell?" he asked. "In the hall. Same as that library do the other week." I nodded, though I did not tell him it was the same as in the King's Arms 2 days before. Some connections are better held in silence until they have cooled enough to examine without distortion. The drizzle had returned, silvering the cobblestones of Jericho and blurring the outlines of the terraced houses. Somewhere a bell struck the hour, muffled, as though even the churches had agreed to keep the afternoon subdued. In my mind, the will, the widow, and the perfume were already occupying the same shelf, not yet ordered, not yet labelled, but together in a place I would return to. It was Lionel Trant who sent the note. Handwritten, discreet, folded once, and left for me with the porter. The kind of summons that implied a confidence not yet earned. I found him in his rooms overlooking the quad, a fire laid but unlit, the curtains drawn against what little light the afternoon possessed. His manner was that of a man weighing every syllable for its eventual worth. He began without preface. Agnes Feltham, he said, had come to him not long before her death with certain concerns. His voice dropped, though we were alone, to that conspiratorial register reserved for matters of money and morality. She had found discrepancies in the college accounts. Irregularities, he called them. Sums shifted between funds, items purchased but never received, entries erased and replaced in a hand. Less practiced than hers. She had been preparing, so he claimed, to take the matter directly to Sir Clement, and Sir Clement, according to Trant, was a man who would have gone to great lengths to preserve the untarnished facade of St. Simeon's. It was possible, even probable, that Agnes's persistence had provoked more than mere irritation. Trant allowed a pause here, letting the implication expand into the space between us. The suggestion was neat. Too neat, yet neatness has a way of persuading the weary mind. I asked where Sir Clement had been on the day of her death. At home, he had said in our first conversation, attending to college business. Now, with Trant's suspicion in mind, I found a small inconsistency. The porter's book recorded the warden leaving the gates mid-morning and not returning until dusk. No official engagement appeared in the diary for that day. Lewis, when told, muttered that it was beginning to add up. But things that add up too swiftly tend to have been calculated for one's benefit. I returned to Trant's rooms that evening, without Lewis, under the pretense of clarifying the dates. The fire was now lit, throwing an amber sheen over the polished desk. He repeated his account almost word for word, the same carefully placed pauses, the same modest shrug at the end, as if to say, "Make of it what you will." I noticed his hands, long fingers, nails neatly kept, resting too still on the arm of his chair. The stillness was not natural, it was practiced. In my experience, truth is rarely rehearsed. Lies, however, benefit from repetition. When I pressed him for examples of the supposed irregularities, he grew vague. Purchases of equipment, unspecified. Payments for maintenance, though he could not recall to which buildings. It was the kind of vagueness that might have been ignorance, but in a bursar, ignorance is rarely unaccompanied by intention. As I left, the rain had gathered itself into a steady curtain, cloaking the quad in a muted shimmer. The cloisters echoed faintly underfoot. Somewhere in the darkness, a student laughed. Too brightly for the weather, too briefly for genuine amusement. Lewis joined me at the gate, having spoken to the porter again. The warden's departure that day was confirmed. The timing would have allowed for a visit to Agnes's flat, but confirmation is not the same as proof. In the cold air, I thought again of Trant's performance. The measured disclosure, the unchanging phrasing, the suggestion offered like a wrapped gift whose contents one is meant to guess at rather than open. I had been handed a story in which every piece fit, the edges smoothed so that nothing would snag the mind, and yet my mind snagged all the same. Not on what Trant had said, but on the way he had chosen to say it. It was Lewis who made the journey to Cornwall. I had suggested he go alone, partly because there was work to be done in Oxford, partly because I have never been able to regard Cornwall without thinking of holidays taken and lost. He returned late the next evening, damp from the train, carrying a battered cardboard folder under his arm and the smell of sea wind in his coat. Her cousin's cottage, he said, was small enough to hear the kettle from every room. A tidy place, full of things kept not for beauty, but for their refusal to break. She had kept Agnes's diary since the funeral, unsure whether the police would want it. It was an unremarkable book at first glance, lined pages, the dates pre-printed, the handwriting compact and unfailingly neat. Agnes recorded the weather, the receipt of letters, the return of books from friends too slow to read them. There was something almost clerical in her daily notations, as if life itself were a set of transactions to be balanced at week's end. But then came the gap. 1 week entirely removed, dates torn out so cleanly the binding had not frayed. Not the end of a year, not the beginning. Just an arbitrary absence in late September, the very week she was meant to have been in Oxford. I turned the pages slowly, the sound of paper reminding me of the turning of leaves outside the Bodleian in windless weather. In the middle of that absence, a single page had survived. Why it had been spared, I could not guess. It held only one line, written without flourish, as if meant to be understood by no one but herself. Saw her again, can't be mistaken. The pronoun hung in the air as I read it, silent but heavy. Her. Not a name, not a title, just that unqualified certainty. I studied the line twice, then a third time. The handwriting was hers, but the formation of the letters had shifted. A sharper descent on the G, the S less rounded. People's script can change with mood. In this case, the mood had been something other than calm. Lewis sat opposite me, watching my face as I closed the diary. He had asked the cousin about the missing pages. She claimed not to know when they had been removed, possibly before the diary came into her possession, possibly after. She had not read beyond the dates that remained. Outside, the rain had thickened into a steady percussion against the windows. The room smelled faintly of damp wool and the whiskey Lewis had poured without asking. Who did she see? He asked. It was the question I was asking myself, but the answer was not to be found in the quiet of my sitting room. It might have been Mrs. Swithin, the widow in Jericho, or Dr. Evelyn Marsh, with her too-ready store quotations. It might have been someone not yet visible to us. The important fact was not who, but that Agnes believed she could not be mistaken, and that she had chosen to record it, even while removing the rest. I left the diary on the table, its pages lying as still as the surface of a pond at dusk. Somewhere in those missing leaves was a truth that had either frightened her or convinced her to act, and the pronoun that unadorned, unclarified her would not leave me. In my experience, a pronoun left standing alone is rarely a placeholder. It is a shield. Dr. Evelyn Marsh received me in her rooms at St. Simeon's, the air within steeped in that unmistakable mixture of paper, dust, and the faint residue of a recent fire. A log still smouldered in the grate, producing more scent than heat. Her rooms had the curated disorder of a mind determined to be thought of as brilliant. Books in uneven stacks, papers face down on the floor as though dropped mid-thought, a shawl carelessly arranged on the arm of a chair in a way that could only have been deliberate. She began with poetry, as I had expected. Tennyson, then Yeats, then back again. The lines rolled out with that precise intonation of someone accustomed to delivering them to an audience too polite to object. I let her talk. People who quote often will, eventually, tell you what they do not intend to. When I asked about Agnes Feltham, the tone shifted. They had known each other for years, yes. An unlikely friendship, she said, for Agnes had little patience with what she called theatricals, by which I suspected she meant people rather than performances. Still, there had been mutual respect. She spoke the words slowly, as if gauging the weight of each before letting it fall. I asked, as if in passing, whether her relationship with the bursar, Lionel Trent, was as professional as it appeared. A pause, only a breath, but enough to mark the change. She looked at me directly then, her gaze steady in that calculated way that suggests the truth is not so much being offered as endured. Yes, there had been something. He was married, of course, but such arrangements are not uncommon in academic circles, where the heart is often considered a secondary faculty. And Agnes's view? I asked. Disapproving, certainly. But she would never meddle. Evelyn leaned back as she said this, the phrase so final it might have been rehearsed. I let the silence linger, then remarked, as if from nowhere, on the memorial display in the library. I recited the line as it had been written there. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have lost at all." She smiled faintly. For a moment I thought she might correct me. When I did so myself, loved, not lost, a faint color rose in her cheeks. An error made once might be dismissed. Made twice, in the same place and by the same people, it suggested connection. The room seemed warmer then, though the fire had not revived. Evelyn rose, ostensibly to fetch a book she thought might interest me. I noted, in that brief interval when her back was turned, a small dressing table in the corner. Upon it stood an empty bottle, heavy glass, cut in a style now largely abandoned by the perfumers who court modern fashion. I had smelled it twice already in this business. First in the King's Arms, then in Mrs. Swithin's hallway. Here, the bottle was without its contents, a memory of scent rather than the scent itself. When she returned, she placed the book, a thin volume of Shenstone's verse, on the table between us. She did not mention the bursar again, nor did I press her further on Agnes. Some truths, when newly disturbed, require time to settle before they will emerge. As I left, the air in the stairwell felt cooler, thinner. Lewis, waiting outside, asked what I had found. Only that poetry, when misquoted, tells you as much about the speaker as about the poem, I said. And perfume? He asked, with that sideways glance of his. That, I replied, tells you more than either. It was Lewis who brought me the paper. an old Oxford mail clipping from the late 70s, yellowed and brittle, the sort that crumbles at the edges when you so much as look at it. The headline, stark and efficient, read, "Bodleian assistant resigns amid book theft allegations." The photograph was grainy but unmistakable. Mrs. Helena Swithin, 20 years younger, her hair darker, her eyes still carrying that wary gleam I had noticed in Jericho. The article was sparse on detail. The allegations had apparently not progressed to charges. The Bodleian declined to comment. She had resigned voluntarily and moved to pursue other opportunities. The wording had that careful neutrality one sees when the truth is messy and no one wants to risk libel. The connection to Agnes's will was too convenient to ignore. A rare 18th century volume bequeathed to a woman with a history, however unproven, of stealing rare books. It didn't require much imagination to sketch the rest. Agnes discovers the past, confronts her, perhaps even accuses her of planning to sell the book. Mrs. Swithin silences her. Clean, tidy, satisfying. I dislike cases that feel satisfying too soon. Still, the theory had weight. I found myself picturing that sealed envelope on Mrs. Swithin's desk, the one she kept glancing toward. Payment, blackmail, a confession. If the book was the lure, the envelope could be the net. Lewis and I revisited her house that evening. The curtains were drawn, no light in the windows. A neighbor, leaning on a gate and smelling faintly of gin, told us she had gone away sudden-like that afternoon. No forwarding address, just the sound of a taxi pulling away. At the station later, over a lukewarm coffee, Lewis speculated aloud. If she knew we were closing in, she'd have bolted. The neighbor's description of a heavy case suggested she wasn't just visiting friends. "You think she did it?" he asked. "I think," I said, "that she wants us to think she did it." And yet, part of me was tempted to stop digging. A neat package is easy to hand in, but a nagging voice, my own unfortunately, kept repeating that single diary line. Saw her again. Can't be mistaken. I fetched the copy of the diary from my desk drawer. The handwriting in that week, the missing week, was hurried, cramped, the way one writes when anxious to record, but equally anxious not to be seen writing. And that pronoun, her. It was a pronoun without an anchor. In the absence of context, the mind does what it always does. It attaches the nearest available figure. Mrs. Swithin had been convenient. Too convenient. I reread it 3 times, slowly, testing the weight of it in my mind. If Agnes had truly meant Swithin, why not name her? She had named others freely in earlier pages. The omission felt deliberate or protective, which meant the her might be someone whose name, if written, would be dangerous. Dangerous to Agnes. Dangerous to someone else. The satisfaction I had briefly felt drained away, leaving the familiar hollow space where certainty ought to be. Mrs. Swithin might still have a part in this business, but she was no longer my centerpiece. I closed the diary and looked out through the office blinds. The city beyond was smudged by a drizzle that seemed to have settled in for the night. Lewis was right. Swithin had run, but she might not be running from us. And if she wasn't, then somewhere in Oxford, the real her was still walking free. It was the smell of overbrewed tea and damp overcoats that greeted me in the narrow, overheated tea room on St. Giles, the sort of place that makes you want to leave as soon as you arrive, which is probably why Mrs. Swithin had chosen it. She was already seated in the farthest booth, her handbag clamped under one arm like it contained the crown jewels. She looked older than when I'd last seen her, as if those few days in hiding had sanded away whatever was left of her confidence. "I didn't run from you," she began before I'd even sat down. "I ran from—" She stopped herself and took a prim sip of tea. "Well, from trouble. I let her talk, making only the smallest noises of encouragement. Eventually, she reached into the handbag and slid a cream envelope across the table. Its flap was unsealed, but folded in on itself the way people do when they expect to open it again soon. "Agnes gave me this," she said. "She told me, and I remember her exact words, 'If anything happens to me, you give this to the police.'" The paper inside was heavy, the ink a steady black, the handwriting precise. It looked, at first glance, like nothing more than a short addendum to a will. Agnes bequeathed certain personal effects to various people. Books, mostly, along with her old writing desk. The tone was formal, almost cold. I read it once, straight through, and saw nothing unusual. But habits formed over years of disappointment die hard. I read it again, slower this time, speaking the words under my breath. And then I heard it. A line near the end, meant as a flourish. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Only that wasn't quite what she had written. Instead, in perfect script, and not yield. No, to. A small omission, invisible unless you knew the Tennyson line by heart. And I did. I looked up. "This is exactly as she gave it to you." "Yes," Mrs. Swithin said, clearly puzzled. I leaned back in my chair. The misquotation was no accident. I had heard it before. Not in Agnes's voice, but in Dr. Evelyn Marsh's. She had made the same slip during our interview, when she'd smugly recited the line to me across her book-lined office. At the time, I had corrected her, and she had flushed ever so slightly. Now, here it was again, buried in a letter that should have been straightforward, which meant one of two things. Agnes was quoting Marsh deliberately, or Marsh herself had a hand in writing or dictating this page. I asked Swithin when she had last seen Agnes. She described a brief meeting outside the Sheldonian Theatre 2 days before the death. Agnes had been agitated but lucid. She handed over the envelope, saying only, "You'll know if you have to use it." "And you didn't think to give it to us earlier?" I asked. "I thought perhaps it was nothing. And after I heard I might be under suspicion." She glanced away, ashamed. The tea room seemed suddenly smaller, the air thicker. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and into my own coat pocket. It wasn't the content that mattered now. It was the fingerprint of language. And language I knew could be as incriminating as any physical trace. As we parted outside, rain feathering down onto the cobblestones, I told Swithin to keep herself available. She looked as if she wanted to protest, but thought better of it. Walking back toward the station, I felt the case narrowing again. Not toward a stolen book, nor toward the bursar's ledger, but toward the woman who quoted poetry with precision, except when she didn't. The college archives were a low-ceilinged room tucked beneath the chapel, where the scent of must and ancient paper lingered like a whispered secret. Dust motes drifted in the shafts of fading afternoon light, and the only sound was the quiet turn of pages and the occasional cough from a nearby reader. I was alone with the past, rifling through folders and albums of black and white photographs when I found it. A group portrait of the saint, Simeon's library staff, dated 1976, the men in stiff collars and the women in the modest blouses of the era, their faces arranged in neat rows that might have been meant to last forever. Dr. Evelyn Marsh stood near the center, her posture formal, her gaze steady. But it was the woman beside her who caught my attention, a striking figure with sharp eyes and a defiant tilt of the chin. The photograph captured something more than just a likeness. It captured a presence. That presence was marked by a faint trace of something I knew well, the same elusive perfume Agnes had worn, the scent I had followed like a ghost through Oxford's streets and rooms. The woman was Evelyn's sister, as I learned from a yellowed note tucked inside the album. Cecilia Marsh, long presumed dead, after disappearing abroad in her early 20s. The official story was that she had vanished, swallowed by some reckless impulse or worse. The college had long since stopped speaking her name, yet here she was, immortalized in that fragile snapshot, standing close enough to touch Evelyn. A sister, yes, but also a secret. I thought of Agnes's diary entry again. Saw her again. Can't be mistaken. It was beginning to make terrible sense. Agnes had seen Cecilia in Oxford recently, despite the silence surrounding her disappearance. She had smelled the perfume, recognized the presence, and chosen to write a pronoun rather than a name. Why? Perhaps to protect someone, or perhaps to protect herself. And then the darker thought. Evelyn, with all her carefully measured words and academic poise, had been guarding this secret for decades. The misquoted poetry, the subtle lies, the empty bottle on her dresser. All pieces of a facade assembled with precision. If Agnes had uncovered the truth, that Cecilia was alive and close by, it might have been enough to threaten everything Evelyn had worked to conceal. The question then was no longer who had wanted Agnes silent. It was why Evelyn had been willing to go so far to ensure the past remained buried. I closed the album with a deliberate quietness. Some images are meant to stay in the dark, but not all of them can. Outside, the sky was thickening with dusk, and somewhere the bells began their slow, melancholy toll. Oxford had not changed, but the shadows within it had grown deeper. I tucked the photograph into my coat pocket. It was time to confront Evelyn again. The cloisters were empty that evening, the damp stone cool beneath my feet, and the sky a dull wash of twilight. Evelyn met me beneath the ancient arches, her silhouette framed by the last pale light filtering through the fading leaves. No words were needed at first. The air carried the weight of things long concealed. She spoke quietly, each word measured as though it might shatter if spoken too loudly. Her sister, Cecilia, had survived far longer than anyone believed, living under an assumed name to escape a scandal that would have ruined them both. The details were sparse, delivered in fragments. A misstep, a betrayal, a whispered accusation in a world that does not forgive easily. Agnes's unexpected sighting threatened everything. To have the past pulled into the present was to risk unraveling years of careful construction. Evelyn's scholarly reputation, her standing within the college, the fragile peace she had built around them all. I did not interrupt as she explained how fear had driven her, how the desire to protect family can blur the lines between right and wrong. The decision to silence Agnes was not born of selfishness, but of desperate love. A love complicated, damaged, but no less real for its shadowed edges. When she paused, I ventured a single question about the perfume, that elusive scent that had trailed, like a ghost through this case. She nodded, eyes downcast. "It was Cecilia's," she said. "Borrowed for one evening, a fragment of identity carried in a bottle. Her confession hung between us, neither absolution nor condemnation, but a quiet truth laid bare in the stillness of the stone." I said little, knowing that some stories are not meant to be resolved in words. The silence, as always, spoke loudest. As she turned and disappeared into the gathering dusk, I felt the familiar ache, that mixture of sorrow and understanding which, in this city of spires and shadows, often feels like the only lasting companion. Lewis, ever the pragmatist, had already begun filing the final reports, his fingers tapping methodically across the keyboard as if to will the case fully closed. I watched him from the doorway of the library, where the heavy curtains were drawn and the fading light gave the rows of books a muted solemnity. The room smelled of old paper and wax polish, but beneath that familiar scent, faint and elusive, was the trace of perfume, the one that had haunted this case from the first. I let my mind drift beyond the neatly ordered facts and timelines, to places less certain but more enduring. Women I had known, loved, and ultimately lost, their presence lingering like a fragile melody beneath the more discordant notes of life, the way memory, much like scent, resists clarity, instead weaving fragments together in a pattern understood only by the heart. There was truth here, yes, but also shadows. Truths half seen, meanings that shifted with the light, and stories told in glances or silences rather than confession. The case itself was done, but its echo would continue in the quiet spaces of thought and remembrance. I stood still for a moment, listening to the muffled footsteps of college life beyond these walls, the soft rustle of pages turned by students long since gone. Oxford was a city built on history and secrets, where every stone held a story waiting to be uncovered, or deliberately left to sleep. The window panes trembled with the first whisper of snow, and outside, the world began to pale beneath a gentle white. I breathed in the cool air, the scent of winter and faint perfume mingling like a final, elusive riddle. Some mysteries, I reflected, are not solved by logic or evidence alone. They are carried quietly, held tenderly in the mind, returning unbidden to a single moment, the memory of a scent. I turned away from the window, the light dimming behind me, and stepped back into the shadows of the library, where stories wait to be told and retold, always with a hint of something lost between the lines.